Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Jacob Lebenz, and I direct the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University. This evening, it is our pleasure to host, as our final event of the fall season, Louis Schmidt. I had the pleasure of meeting Louis about 2 years ago when he gave a similar lecture at Temple Road of Shalom here in Youngstown. We immediately understood that it would be important for my students to hear Louis speak, and also for him to have an opportunity to reach additional people in the Youngstown area, and now, thanks to Zoom, well beyond. Louis Schmidt, bring this down here, excuse me. Louis Schmidt interviewed Holocaust survivors for the Shoah Foundation, which was created after Steven Spielberg's Oscar win for Schindler's List. More than 55,000 testimonies bring the lessons of the Holocaust and a message of tolerance for future generations. Mr. Schmidt is a winner of 3 Emmy and 4 ACE Awards and the silver medal from the International Film and Television Festival of New York. He was formerly a reporter for LOOKMagazine and a senior producer for NFL films for over 30 years. I'm particularly happy to have Louis here with us. My students rely, every time I teach the Holocaust, upon the testimonies from the collection that Louis contributed to write their final papers. They choose a theme from anything in the Holocaust, anything we've studied, what they want to learn more about. And then they use the voices and recollections of Holocaust survivors as evidence to help craft an argument and expand their knowledge about the Holocaust. In class, they've already been doing, I've started to look at them. In class next Tuesday, my students are going to report on their projects to each other. So this is really generative of new knowledge. And so I'm highly appreciative of Louis being here. We're going to start with a brief film, but I want to give Louis a chance to introduce it.
Well, this will be a very brief introduction because for those of you, if anyone out there is not sure what or doesn't know what the Shoah Foundation is, there's no better person to explain it than Steven Spielberg. So I'll hand it over to him.
Okay.
Making Schindler's List was an experience that truly changed my life. Filming just outside the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I realized that had I been standing on that exact spot at a different point in time, I more than likely would have been killed too. I remember talking to a lot of survivors during the production. How did you survive?
By miracle.
It was one of the first moments that made me realize that there were many, many stories that needed to be told. That's how the Shoah Foundation began. It began, I guess, my wanting to continue Schindler's List.
It was a tremendous undertaking. There were thousands of people all over the world who came together to collect the 52,000 survivor testimonies.
Je mène une interview de Madame Annie Abelansky.
The location is London, England.
Henryk Mandelbaum, nazwany w języku polskim.
Malka de Hausmann. Okay.
The original collection was taken in 56 countries in 32 languages. The survivors gave us their testimony so that we would tell the world and educate future generations.
I'm at an age where I don't know how much longer I'll be here. I felt it's important that it's not forgotten.
The survivors who give us their stories trusted us to hold on to those stories and teach with them far into the future. So it's our responsibility to preserve them, to make sure that they're here now and 100 years from now.
Here is a place where we explore ideas of all kinds. We want our students to understand the world as broadly as we can, and the Shoah Foundation does that. It really addresses humanistic problems. From a research perspective, this is an unbelievable tool, thinking not only about our own scholarship, not only about what we can accomplish here at USC, but what we can put out there in the world.
This archive is based at USC, but we have many university partners around the world. We work with faculty and students in many disciplines. Students are watching testimony in their own languages, learning what it means to be human and to go through that experience and to make it part of their story in the world today.
We're going to be listening to individual stories because history happens to individuals.
Two little boys came in and they were looking at my father, just staring at him. The one said, well, we were told when you look a Jew in the eye, you can see the devil in there. He says, I just wanted to see if that's true. A little 8-year-old kid.
Genocides have not stopped since the Holocaust. It's really important to expand the archive with new content.
We're now collecting testimony from a variety of different genocides that have taken place in recent history. We really can't compare human suffering, but the causes and consequences of violent and genocidal societies we need to understand better and deeper.
All these examples of intolerance and racial hatred have to be taught, so the young people, the next generation, will never allow this to ever happen again.
Young people are forming who they want to be. They're developing their identity. They're figuring out what they think about things, how they should be behaving.
I always feel guilty, like if something happens to someone else and I just sit by and watch because I don't want to get involved. And I think it's important that you do get involved.
There will be occasions when we have to make the choice. Are we bystanders or do we act?
Our attitudes really do matter to the way in which the world works. If we can't make this work in our own backyard, we'll never make it work in the world.
When you see an injustice, stand up and speak up and take a stand.
Try to understand each other. And if you cannot love each other, at least respect each other.
We have a message. We were there. We can talk about it.
I've seen young people, young students who have seen these testimonies. It does change them. And that always gives me hope that the more we get this out into the world, thousands and someday millions of young people will be in some way changed by this. And these survivors who are now educators, they can change the world.
Okay. There is great power in remembrance. And that is at the very root of Steven Spielberg's extraordinary project, the Shoah Foundation, which videotaped and archived precious and unfortunately diminishing Holocaust stories in the mid-1990s. I consider myself privileged to have been chosen to participate in this historic and unprecedented mission as an extremely well-trained rescuer of history, doing what we all referred to at the time as holy work, members of a small army of interviewers sent around the globe. What you are about to hear is the untold story of how these stories were told. Steven Spielberg has described his founding of the Shoah Foundation as the most important work of his entire professional career. I myself feel exactly the same way. I've had a long career in journalism that has enabled me to meet and interview many celebrated people. But nothing I've accomplished in my entire life has given me more satisfaction, more value than working on behalf of the Shoah Foundation. I want to be clear that my talk today is about my own personal experience. I'm not a Holocaust scholar, nor am I an official of the Shoah Foundation. But I was part of a well-oiled, incredibly efficient organization that attempted a task that had never before been accomplished. And that task was to videotape, index, and archive eyewitness testimonies about the heroes and heroines of the Holocaust. To preserve history by putting a human face on the genocide of a people whose only crime was being born Jewish. And it had to be done quickly because the clock was ticking. Time was running out. The foundation's stated mission reads, to overcome prejudice, intolerance, and hatred, and the suffering they cause through the educational use of the Institute's visual testimony. By the end of the project, the foundation taped nearly 55,000 interviews in 65 countries, in 43 different languages, and is the largest digital collection of visual history in the world. Besides survivors, we interviewed liberators, witnesses, political prisoners, members of the resistance, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and children of survivors. I was born in 1940. I am a child of World War II, and at an early age, I was keenly aware of its existence. I remember the blackouts, rationing, and my uncles in uniform. My two most vivid memories are of my father, who was an air raid warden, putting on his white civil defense helmet and belt and leaving our house in the black of night. I would sit in the dark, lights out, shades drawn with my grandfather, and wait for the all-clear siren to herald his safe return. My other indelible remembrance of the war was a terrible fear of Japanese soldiers. I had seen a magazine photo of one holding his saber aloft in the act of decapitating a POW. Many mornings I was afraid to get out of bed and look out my window because I was certain I would see Japanese soldiers goose-stepping down the wide boulevard outside my bedroom window. And for you Youngstowners, that wide boulevard was Glenwood Avenue. At my young age, I had mixed up the Axis power and mistakenly consigned the goose step to Japan instead of Germany. And to make matters even more frightening, for me, the Japanese even looked different. In one of the ironies that life seems to offer so often, a few years ago, my youngest son, Jake, married a Japanese-American girl from San Francisco. She and her family got a big laugh when they heard my wartime story. But there's another, more serious side to this anecdote, because my daughter-in-law, Leslie, who's a fifth-generation American, had grandparents who, along with 110,000 others of Japanese heritage, at the cost of their freedom, livelihoods, and dignity, were incarcerated in internment camps on the West Coast for the duration of the war. In 1942, after the US entered the war, President Roosevelt had signed Executive Order number 9066, which forced Japanese American citizens of this country to evacuate their homes. To emphasize the injustice of this black mark in our country's history, Leslie's grandfather and his brothers were serving as clerks in the US Army at the same time their wives and children were imprisoned behind barbed wire. Those early experiences were the genesis of my lifelong fascination with World War II. And 49 years later, in 1994, when I watched Steven Spielberg accept his Academy Award for his iconic film, Schindler's List, I raptly listened while he explained his life-altering experience filming it. It was there on the Academy stage that he revealed his concept for what would soon become the Shoah Foundation. And when I heard it, I knew I had to be a part of it. I immediately wrote to the foundation's headquarters at DreamWorks Studio in Los Angeles and told them of my desire to participate. And I soon received a reply that they would contact me once a Philadelphia office was established. The foundation first concentrated on the coastal population centers in New York and LA. I had nearly given up hope when a year later, an application finally arrived. Thus, in mid-June of 1996, I found myself on the campus of Gratz College in suburban Philadelphia for 3 grueling days of intense 10-hour training sessions with 220 people from all corners of the country, some from overseas. Among them were nuns, journalists, teachers, historians, psychologists, children of survivors, and even, I was told, the German progeny of a former Nazi. We listened to the LA-based staff explain the purpose of the project, met with newly appointed regional coordinators, and critiqued hours of previously taped survivor interviews from around the country. Our training homework load was enormous. A hefty training brochure, scores of historical texts, hundreds of pages of geographical notes, and endless amounts of maps. We heard about death marches, liquidations, and crematoriums, and we had lectures on the techniques, methodologies, and problems associated with taping testimony. Most surprisingly, we also were notified that only a few of us would make the final cut to be official Shoah interviewers. And indeed, at the beginning of each session, we noticed there were fewer and fewer of us in the room. On the final day of our training, we each sat across from an actual survivor and conducted a mock interview based on their individual experience, which was then graded and analyzed by Shoah staff members back at Spielberg's DreamWorks in Los Angeles. Days later, we were informed that the total number of applicants had been whittled down from the original 220 to a final 42. And I was very fortunate to be one of them. Another unforeseen component of this comprehensive training was learning to conduct the actual interview itself. In the 1960s, I had been a reporter for LOOKMagazine in Manhattan, and then a senior producer for the National Football League for 33 years. During this time, I interviewed literally hundreds of athletes and celebrities. I thought, after all my experience as a professional in the field, that I certainly knew what I was doing, but I was very wrong. There is a rigid protocol for official documentary filmmaking and interviewing that is different than all other, and any slight deviation from it could invalidate the final result. Among our myriad rules, during an interview, we had to sit completely still, no nonverbal communication, and hardest of all, no reaction to anything we might hear. We had to be detached with no displays of emotion, no visible response to some of the worst stories a survivor could describe. We were to be a blank slate, waiting to be written. We learned to patiently endure long silences. We learned to listen without showing pity. And we learned how to let our subject cry with dignity. What's more, we had to listen without crying ourselves. We learned to put our personal feelings in a metaphorical box that would only be opened much later after the interview had ended. We were asked to create a document that would stand the scrutiny of time, and because of this, the interview room was virtually a vacuum. We wore sensitive lapel mics and were severely downgraded on any extraneous sound we as interviews might inadvertently make. The Shoah staff viewed and analyzed each interview as they were shipped to LA. For example, I received an evaluation about a year into my service that read, "You are a strong interviewer, but you could be a great one." And then it listed explicit suggestions for my future improvements. During our interviews, we would act as guides for these painful journeys through darkness. Many survivors had never talked about their experience, and many decided to speak while they still could, so their children and the world could know what took place. Our job, let them tell their story their own way, then dig even deeper. If a survivor made a factual error, we were not to correct them, but at interview's end, gently suggest they rethink specific dates or places that we knew to be accurate. We relied on our extensive research to spur a memory or suggest another fact that we had learned, but the elderly person across from us may have forgotten due to the cobwebs of time. For the most part, we ask historical questions, but were so well prepared, we already knew most of the answers to come. I was the leader of a three-man crew consisting of myself, the interviewer, a professional videographer, and an assistant that stayed outside the interview area to ensure there would be no interruptions. If there was a stop in the taping for any reason, the entire process could be tainted. The only breaks allowed came when the tape ran out every 30 minutes. Then there was a brief period for standing, stretching, a bathroom break, and perhaps some encouragement. Most sessions took at the very least 4 to 5 hours. Some of the more memorably exhausting ones lasted as long as 15. Many afternoons or evenings after leaving an interview, I pulled my car to the side of the road and sat alone for great lengths of time, attempting to absorb what I had just heard. I should note here that the Institute did provide psychological support for any of us that needed it. Then the foundation allowed us to marinate a few days before scheduling a new assignment for us. The first step after being given a new assignment was the all-important pre-interview, in which 1 week before the official talk was scheduled, I went alone to the survivor's home, where all interviews were conducted, to meet for the first time and perform a well-researched 2-hour review of their life. At this time, the subject was also asked to provide any relevant photos, documents, or artifacts that would be videotaped with their voiceover descriptions at interview's end. This initial meeting also served as a critical icebreaker between the two of us. Then, armed with this fresh information, I had days of further study to prepare for the official interview 1 week later. I can't emphasize enough the tremendous weight of responsibility I personally felt to conduct an interview that would maximize the results of this precious one-time opportunity for each survivor. On the day of the taping, everyone on my crew had their assignments. My assistant took all phones in the house off the hook. Remember, this was 1996. Everyone had a landline, and a do not disturb sign was placed on the front door. All clocks and watches were removed, the air conditioning turned off because its constant hum would be picked up by our microphones. And I placed a glass of water and tissues within reach of the interviewee. I made sure the survivor was seated in their own most comfortable chair, and all distracting artwork behind them was removed. The camera's total focus had to be on the survivor. Our professional videographer was provided with state-of-the-art broadcast quality Betacam SP video, which was the standard TV format in the 90s. The interview was slated with the date, survivor's name, my name, the city and country where the interview took place, and the language that would be used. Only then could I give the signal to begin. All interviews were divided into 3 distinct parts: pre-war, war, and post-war. Some of our first pre-war questions might have seemed a bit odd to the survivor, but they often prompted revealing answers. What kind of a child were you before the war? What did your mother cook for dinner? Do you remember certain household smells? And of course, did you encounter any acts of anti-Semitism? The less pointed and reflective questions were saved for the very end, the post-war segment. How often do you think about the Holocaust? In what ways did it shape your life? Why do you think you survived? And now, 50 years later, what message might you give to future generations? At the conclusion, the survivor was invited to ask any spouse, children, and grandchildren to appear on camera with them for the final moments. The very last shot of every interview was of the survivor seated on a sofa, surrounded by family, if indeed they were fortunate enough to have any family. On September 13th, 1996, I conducted my very first interview. Right from the start, everything I learned and the protocol I was given in my training went right out the window. In a determined voice that made my heart sink, this man completely ignored my first question about his pre-war life and informed me that he was about to reveal something he had never spoken to anyone before. I am using this chance to speak directly to my sons and finally explain why I am the kind of father I've been, he told me. As a child in Romania, he had suffered a traumatic incident with his own father that was totally unrelated to the war, but he was now in a verbal role. We were off topic, but there was nothing I could do but listen, all the while pondering how long and how painfully he must have waited to get this burden off his chest. Stunningly, for a man who had kept his feelings and Holocaust history locked deep inside of him for most of his life, he is today very active as a public speaker. He talks to school children about the lessons of the Holocaust. And several times I've seen articles in the local newspaper that depict him surrounded by school children. Remember, this was a man who kept silent for over 50 years. The Shoah Foundation had opened a window for him, and his life was changed forever. Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." After this shaky beginning, he then began to tell his Holocaust story. At age 15, he and his family were deported to Auschwitz, existing on small pieces of bread and stolen potatoes amidst horrific conditions. Then the Nazis forced him and thousands of younger inmates on a death march to Dachau. Once there, after months of working endlessly at crushingly hard labor, he felt he could go on no longer and requested a visit to the infirmary. That act in itself was a death wish because it signaled to the Nazis that your usefulness was over. Yes, they nursed you back to health, then put you to death. On April 29th, 1945, resigned to his fate, He was ordered to join a long line which slowly inched closer to its destination, the crematorium. As this silent column of prisoners turned a corner, ominous smoke curling up from a chimney was visible. There stood a low-slung, one-story building known as Barracks 10, Dachau's gas chamber. Every inmate knew they literally had minutes to live. Suddenly, whispering was heard throughout the line. Strange, because this was impermissible. The voices got louder. What's happening? Where are the guards? Soon, jeeps with 5-pointed white stars painted on their doors rumbled into camp amid shouts of Americans. The Americans are finally here. On this providential April day, the prisoners of Dachau had been rescued by the U.S. 7th Army. Excuse me. I can't begin to describe to you what it was like sitting across from this hunched man, hearing his story told in a stoic monotone. It was like an overly dramatic fictional Hollywood ending, except it was true. It all had happened. This survivor's tale of the fragility of life was amply documented. He had survived the terror and utter hopelessness of the concentration camps. To me, this is the quintessential Holocaust story, the difference between life and death, measured in minutes. Yes, many were saved, but think about the unfortunate souls that were not rescued that very same day, but might have been, but for a few precious ticks of the clock. Another interview I conducted weeks later involved an aged, rail-thin woman who was dying of cancer. She had been born in Minsk and taken to Auschwitz, where she survived. After the war, she began a lengthy search for her husband, who had been forced to fight on the Russian front against his will. It was rumored he was imprisoned in a Soviet gulag. It took this woman years of an epic journey, traveling through Russia to finally locate him, then bribe her way to his cell. Barely recognizable, he begged her to leave and forget him, because though barely alive, he felt he was already dead. She sorrowfully departed and never saw him again. Still another interview was with an Austrian woman who survived because of the famed Kindertransport, which was a rescue mission that saved 10,000 Jewish children just before the start of the war. In 1939, at the age of 6, she stood on a rail platform in Vienna and bid her parents goodbye for the final time. When the war finally began, Germany stopped all child transports to Great Britain. No more Jewish children could be extracted from harm's way. 50 years later, in 1989, there was a well-attended Kindertransport reunion at Prince Albert Hall in London. And the now adults, former refugees, came from all over the world and rejoiced. As an aside, after a lecture I gave at a synagogue several years ago, 2 women approached and told me that each of them had survived the Holocaust because of the Kindertransports. Interestingly, they had never met until that very moment. But for me, their very presence crystallized the words of my speech into the powerful reality of seeing these 2 women alive and standing directly before me. Another interview I directed showed me just how close to home these assignments could take me. It occurred in Bala Cynwyd, a Philadelphia suburb where I was living at the time. When I went for the pre-interview to meet the survivor, I realized I had driven by her corner property countless times and was always struck by the beauty of her landscaping and location. She had been born in Königsberg, Germany, and deported with her mother and sister to the Kovno ghetto. Eventually, the two sisters, because they were young and could be used for labor, were taken to the Stutthof concentration camp in a secluded, wet, wooded area near the city of Danzig. Conditions in this camp were unrelentingly harsh and severe, but the two sisters managed to bribe a guard to bring their elderly mother from the ghetto to be with them. She was hidden under bales of hay in a horse-drawn cart that made its way to the camp many miles away. When the cart arrived, the two daughters discovered their mother had died from exposure during the trip. Distraught, they bribed the guard once again, this time for a shovel to bury their mother. He permitted them to drag her body into the woods on the fringe of the camp, but the freezing ground was too hard to penetrate with his shovel. The two sisters had to cover their mother's body with fallen tree branches, whisper a final hurried prayer, and return to the camp heartbroken. After that interview, whenever I drove past this beautiful house in my own neighborhood, all I could think about was that behind the doors of this seemingly peaceful home was a woman who had endured and survived unimaginable misery and unspeakable horror. Just a few miscellaneous points of interest I'd like to share with you before I finish. In 2006, Steven Spielberg donated the Shoah Foundation to the University of Southern California. So its official name is now the USC Shoah Foundation, and the organization is now dedicated to recording genocide survivors of any kind. For those of you that may not be aware, Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe, or in this case, Holocaust. And throughout my time with the Shoah Foundation, a surprising hurdle I occasionally faced was my last name, Schmidt. It's a very common German name, uncommon to Jews. So several of my survivors told me it made them uncomfortable, for it evoked names they had heard in the camps, and were warily relieved when I assured them that I was indeed Jewish. Additionally, during the war, there were Jews who were so thoroughly German, they thought Nazi policies wouldn't affect them. In their minds, they were German first and Jews second. Many fought as officers for Germany in World War I and couldn't believe the country they loved and risked their lives for could ever turn on them. And lastly, a compelling aspect of the Holocaust is the phenomenon of lost Jews. Many Jewish children were secretly placed with the Christian families who adopted them when their deceased parents were unable to claim them after war's end. Many children never knew about their religious roots, and many to this day are still unaware. Others who did know only revealed their true religion in deathbed confessions. One fascinating story some of you might have heard about came from a woman I knew who for a time was a television reporter in Philadelphia. After getting a network TV job in New York, she later married the celebrated broadcaster Peter Jennings. Her name is Cottie Martin, spelled M-A-R-T-O-N. Martin is a renowned journalist, author, and human rights activist who has enjoyed a vibrant career. Martin knew she was born a Catholic in Hungary, but it wasn't until she was on assignment in Budapest, researching a book about Raoul Wallenberg, that she accidentally discovered her true origins. During her stay, an older couple approached and told her they once knew her parents. When Cottie asked how, they replied they belonged to the same synagogue. Martin laughed and said they were mistaken. But the Hungarian couple persisted, and when Martin returned to the United States and confronted her parents, they finally told her of her Jewish roots. She was truly a child of the Holocaust. Thus ended a 31-year deception that included the disclosure her grandparents were murdered at Auschwitz. This shocking discovery altered Martin's life forever and created a rift with her parents that lingered until their deaths. Since then, Martin has written several successive books with Holocaust themes. After Peter Jennings' death, she married a Jewish man, the well-known diplomat and world troubleshooter, Richard Holbrooke, who also passed away not too long ago. After the war, there was a well-known adage that stated, many born as Jews arrive in the United States as Protestants. An infamous example of this is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who was allegedly unaware of her family's Jewishness until she was 59, when she was vetted for Bill Clinton's administration. She also learned more than a dozen of her family members, including 3 grandparents, had perished in the Holocaust. These are not pleasant stories. But if you're Jewish, they are our stories. And they must continue to be told, especially amidst the troubling political climate we're living now, with world anti-Semitism and Holocaust deniers on the rise. Elie Wiesel said, whoever hears a witness becomes a witness in turn, and therefore can become a voice for memory. Nearly 1/2 of remaining survivors worldwide have died in the last 5 years, and their stories must not die with them. After the Shoah Foundation had finished its mission and closed its regional office around the country, my wife Jan and I traveled to LA and visited Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks Studios, the foundation headquarters. We were given a VIP tour and brought in front of the enormous master computer nicknamed Booby. It was because of this recently refined technology that archiving the 55,000 survivor interviews was even possible. Remember, powerful computers back then tended to be quite large and clunky. My name was fed into the archive's mainframe, and a huge arm hovered overhead and delivered me a printout of all the interviews I had personally conducted for the foundation. DreamWorks was the perfect place for me to achieve closure to my career as a Shoah interviewer, for everything about the foundation was top-notch. Just what you'd expect from any production directed by Steven Spielberg. In conclusion, I would like to remind you that today I've spoken to you about fortunate survivors, not the 6 million victims of Nazi atrocities. So I will end my talk appropriately with the watchwords of Holocaust education. Never forget and never again. It was a pleasure being in your virtual company. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, Louis. Let me make some quick adjustments here. Okay,
let me say one thing, Jacob, just before I take a Q&A. Before I take the questions, any of you found value in my presentation, please share my contact information with any group or institution you think might be interested. I depend entirely on word of mouth. Go ahead, Jake.
Okay. Thank you very much, Louis. Let me make sure that I'm doing this right. Okay, this looks like it's fine. How is this not moving? I apologize. I just want to make sure that we can see other people as they speak.
That would be nice.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna, there we go, unpin this video, and I'm going to, it's spotlighted, and I'm going to cancel the spotlighting. Okay, hopefully this will work. Most important is that they see your face. I want to thank you for speaking to us once again. And I want to add to something with which I started. My students use these films as data or as evidence for their Holocaust studies research paper. And what I found so powerful about inviting Louis into my classroom was that students came to understand the process by which these films became available to them, right? That artifacts, that the things that we use to tell history have stories. Somebody made them, somebody archived them, somebody made them available to you, and that shapes what we have. So I think that's really important. I want to thank Louis for participating in a project from which I've drawn from my own research and is now helping my students. I want to open up the floor to questions from the audience. Unmute yourself and speak up. You can raise your hand if there are a couple of people speaking. If you aren't able to speak or have trouble with the microphones or simply don't want to, you may put questions or comments into the chat and I will be happy to read them for you. Ladies and gentlemen.
It's Doris. I just want to say, Louis, that was outstanding. I'm so glad that I was able to tune in. Wow, is all I can say. I feel up and
I'm glad
teary.
you were too, Doris.
So thank you, Jan, for bringing it to my attention.
Louis, I'm going to leave to go look at a Zoom on row houses in Philadelphia. But it was great, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you, Jay.
Louis?
Yes.
It's Kelly Brown. I can't get my face up here, but you know it, so I don't have to show it to you.
I recognize that voice.
I wanted to add a comment, which is that I recall when you began this journey many, many years ago. And I remember the intensity with which you did so. And I am so grateful that you did and that you brought these experiences to us. It's a value beyond anything I can express. And I am hopeful that my children and their children will become as informed as you allowed us to be. Thank you, Louis, very much.
Thanks, Pelly. Jacob, is there a way I can actually see who's speaking?
Yes, there is. The best thing to do is put on gallery view.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah,
I'd rather see that than.
It'll record based on my perspective, so we don't have to worry about that. Does anyone have any other questions?
I just want to say, you pointed out how this is really extraordinarily important. I'm on the committee, so I've always insisted that the students take a trip, go to Washington see the Jewish Museum. But this is more than a museum, because it is to hear probably the last voices of those who experienced this. And in particular with this new era of fake news, this is probably what the last thing to combat those who continue to deny this. But I had a question for you. During your interviews, did the survivors, any of the survivors pointed out about being aware of these people who denied what happened, and how, or did they actually, like what they said, they did not follow probably what was going on about those who tried to deny it. I would like to know if anybody in your experience, anybody brought up the idea of those people who continue to deny what happened in the post-war interview. Any of those survivors said anything about those who deny the Shoah?
His sound is off.
Louis, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, there's always been Holocaust deniers, even in the midst of the Holocaust. And when I did my interviews in the mid-90s, it was, of course it existed. It wasn't as prevalent as I'm afraid as it is now. So it didn't really come up that much. I mean, all these survivors were reliving these horrors with a goal in mind, either to tell their story for generations and also to warn future generations of what could happen. So they're very aware of the responsibility that they had. But I don't remember anyone specifically talking about Holocaust deniers. I think they were, for the 4 to 5 hours I interviewed them, and then of course hours in the pre-interview, they were concentrated on their experience, which was horrible enough. So the answer to your question is no, I haven't personally run into that. However, I'm certainly aware of it now.
Louis, there are 2 comments in the chat. One person writes, excuse me for looking away from the camera, but I can't read and look at the camera at the same time. How do I get this out there to the next generation? Are you on YouTube? Is there a tape that can be shared? I'd love to share this with my extended family. And someone else asked for your contact information. I can give you the name of that person so you can contact them later. Believe
okay.
me.
That's fine. That's fine.
But the first one is a different question.
Yeah. No, I would love to have been videotaped, and there's no reason I can't be. When I spoke at my my synagogue in Youngstown, where I grew up, Rosh Sholem, the rabbi recorded me audio, but just audio. So I'm not on YouTube, and right now there's no place for me to for anyone to access my presentation. I agree, there should be, and it's something I need to get done, something my wife has asked me to.
Louis, we've recorded this and would be happy to put it on the YouTube account of the YSU Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies. We can make sure that it is appropriately subtitled so it's accessible to all. I would understand as well if you wanted to put that in another forum, but this can be done quite simply.
Okay, great. I'll take Jacob. I'll take you up on that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? I can add if it's too early for anyone to go to bed yet. I can keep you up a little longer by just saying that this has been an extraordinary phase of my life. I've always been a big sports fan, and I was in New York and I worked for LOOKMagazine. I was a journalist. I worked for the National Football League. I interviewed all these people, not all football players, many celebrities like Zsa Zsa Gabor and Suzanne Summers and crazy people you'd never expect. But if you'd have told me that, what is it now, 19 years after I retired in 2001, that I would be going around the country and talking about this, something I did in the mid-90s, I couldn't conceive of it. But it's happened, and I'm certainly better off for it. And it's certainly been gratifying for somebody my age to feel that they're making a contribution in whatever small way I have. And other than that, it's nice to see some familiar face, Karen. And also I have to appreciate my wife. She's in another square and she hung in there with me. How many of these have you sat for? I don't know, but she's of a measurable help and support. And I'll get to the last one. Jacob, thank you again for having, this is a wealth of riches speaking to your groups twice. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And that's it for me. Over and out.
Everyone, this is Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jan, what is it?
I've seen every single time he's either with him in person or Zoom, and it never stops to make me feel every time I hear it. Every time I hear it, the words hang on to me. And there's certain lines I keep writing down every time. I love this part. I love this line, and I love it every time. So thank you, Louis.
Thanks. That's my critic. She critiques me after every speech. And she's merciless.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to host you again. It's nice to see so many new friends and associates of the center. I'm going to put my email up in the chat. If you would like to be added to the center's mailing list, you may send me an email and I would be happy to do so. You can unsubscribe at any time. That is in the chats. So I thank you. You can leave at your own pace. I'll leave this open so that people, for a couple of minutes, so that people can take down my address if they want it and also say their goodbyes to one another. I am cognizant that some of you know each other. Thank you very much and have a good evening.